This is Intelligence Matters, sponsored by Ginkgo Biosecurity, whose cutting-edge biological intelligence platform empowers national security decision-makers to identify and respond to emerging biological threats.
Today, we welcome Dr. Christine Michienzi to Intelligence Matters. Chris is a senior non-resident associate at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Previously, Dr. Michienzi served in the Office of the Secretary of Defense as the Senior Technology Advisor for the Undersecretary of Defense for Acquisition and Sustainment, and the Chief Technology Officer for the Industrial Base Policy Office. Her expertise includes industrial-based supply chains, technology for critical defense capabilities, such as missiles and munitions, microelectronics, critical chemicals, hypersonics, and nuclear modernization. She holds 5 patents and has published dozens of technical papers. Dr. Michienzi received her doctorate in analytic chemistry and Bachelor of Science in Chemistry from the University of Maryland. We're going to take a quick break, and we'll be right back with Chris Michienzi. Biosecurity Matters. What's biosecurity? It's the mission-critical industry safeguarding against 21st century biological threats. Biology doesn't respect borders. Ginkgo Biosecurity monitors critical assets and produces actionable biointelligence for national security decision-makers confronting biological threats, whether they are natural, accidental, or malicious. Ginkgo's technology tracks deadly pathogens worldwide, and our globally scaled platform, the first of its kind, detects outbreaks in near real time, deploys AI-powered threat assessments, and identifies the source of a threat, mitigating outbreaks before they become national emergencies. When lives and livelihoods are on the line, every second counts. Ginkgo Biosecurity, the biosecurity partner for an uncertain new era. Learn more at biosecuritymatters.com. Chris, great to have you on the podcast. You know, I introduced you at the beginning of the podcast, but why don't you start by telling our audience a little bit about your background?
Sure. It's great to be here. I really appreciate the opportunity. I retired about a year ago from the Office of the Secretary of Defense, where I was the Senior Technology Advisor to Bill LaPlante, who is the Undersecretary of Defense for Acquisition and Sustainment, as well as the Chief Technology Officer for the Industrial Base Policy Office, because nobody can just have one job in the Pentagon, apparently. In those roles, I led efforts focused on global supply chains and defense industrial base resiliency and security. I identified and mitigated critical supply chain shortfalls by working with investment teams within OSD, the services, interagency partners, as well as by leading collaborative efforts with partners and allies. Some of the more significant efforts I was focused on prior to my departure were things like leading the CHIPS Act activities for all of ANS and leading the effort to ramp production of all the weapon systems the U.S. was sending to Ukraine. I now own a consulting company, MMR Defense Solutions, that helps companies address supply chain and technical challenges using strategic policy and investment approaches.
Yeah, it's funny. We never really talked about supply chain till after COVID, right? So it was sort of a forcing function, even though we all knew it was a tenuous thing. So let's level set here for the audience. Can you explain what critical minerals are? You know, the ones we hear about all the time are lithium, nickel, copper, cobalt, rare earths. You know, and maybe that's the big list. But why don't we just sort of start by defining what they are?
Sure. Critical minerals are materials that are used to make a variety of subcomponents and components for both commercial and DoD systems. Many of them are distinct chemical elements, such as antimony, lithium, some of the ones that you mentioned, and the rare earth elements that you also mentioned. You hear a lot about rare earth elements. Those are definitely included. But some of them are also chemical compounds, such as a material called barite, which is barium sulfite. The supply chain for critical minerals involves a multi-step process that generally begins with mining the raw material, ore. So you hear a lot about mining when you hear about critical minerals, which that material is then crushed and separated into metal oxides or other chemical forms. And then afterwards, that material is smelted or refined into to produce a purified powder or metal or other material as semi-final form. And then final steps can include further refining, manufacturing, cutting, polishing, or some other process to put it into a finished product. Finished products are things like batteries, semiconductors, and permanent magnets. And those are the types of items that DoD and other agencies and commercial industry buy. So we don't usually buy the rare earths themselves or the critical minerals themselves. We buy those finished products. The U.S. government looks at those material flows through all those various steps because it's really important to identify where there is outsized foreign influence and reliance and vertical integration in those supply chains. In the civilian sector, critical minerals are essential to countless manufactured goods and services. You just be really shocked at the wide range of application for critical minerals, things for anywhere from personal electronics, telecommunications, food and agriculture, finance, healthcare, transportation, public safety, home construction, and definitely sustaining the nation's critical infrastructure, which is a really vital function, obviously. The DoD, which I'm most familiar with, obviously, uses critical minerals to build weapon systems, military ships, tanks, aircraft, satellites, missile systems, and ammunition. You name it, critical minerals is pretty much in everything that we use and live with every day.
So, Chris, something that you just said I hadn't thought about before because, when we started, I listed the ones that I knew of, and those are all natural, right? You dig them out of the ground. But you also sort of suggested it man-made as well, right? Things that you create as opposed to you just sort of mine. Is that fair?
No, it's really all natural materials.
Okay.
So, even the compounds are naturally formed materials.
Okay.
They're just sometimes not just the distinct elements. It's sometimes compounds of materials. So like potassium salts, bismuth salts, some things like that.
Got it. So who is it that determines what falls into this seemingly big basket called critical? Is this do we do this in a national way, or is it each sector defines what's critical for it? How does that, how did we get to this sort of definition?
Right. So the Energy Act of 2020 defines what a critical mineral is, and it's the definition. I'm just going to read it to you.
Yeah, that's great.
Is defined as a non-fuel mineral or mineral material essential to the economic or national security of the United States, and which has a supply chain vulnerable to disruption. So that's important. So it's not just it's essential to economic or national security, but also that its supply chain is vulnerable to disruption. They also go on to characterize critical minerals as serving an essential function in the manufacturing of a product, the absence of which would have significant consequences for the economy or national security. The U.S. Geological Survey released the latest critical minerals list, which contains 50 items in February of 2022, and that list must be reviewed and updated at least every 3 years.
What you said here was things are critical. So if there's a supply of them in the United States, they're not on the list, right? Only the ones that we have to deploy or we have to rely on getting from another nation or location, correct?
Right. If there's some kind of risk to disruption of the material, correct.
What's let's get some specifics here. What would be at the top of lithium? Okay, that's probably in your top 5 somewhere because of batteries, EVs, so on and so forth. What are that top handful? I know there are lots, obviously 50 that you just mentioned, but if you had to think the ones that are most critical, especially to the defense sector, what were those handful? How would you rank order those?
It's difficult to rank order them because they're so ubiquitously used within the Department of Defense. Certainly rare earth elements is going to be near the top of that list. It's a group of 17 metals that are also essential ingredients in many industries.
Chris, you know what I remember about rare earths? They're at the bottom of the periodic table.
Yeah, exactly.
And that's about the extent of, yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, they are so widely used. It just would boggle, people's mind. I mean, they're used in consumer products, your cell phone, your computer hard drive, electric and hybrid vehicles, your flat screen television, but they're also used in defense for, electronic displays, guidance systems, lasers, radar, and sonar systems. Just as an example, a Virginia-class nuclear-powered submarine needs 9,200 pounds of rare earth materials to produce, just one submarine. And the F-35 fighter jet requires 900 pounds of rare earth materials. So certainly that would be one of the things, that I would consider to be a high priority for the Department of Defense.
And those rare earths are typically not found in the United States.
Right. So China accounts for 63% of the world's rare earth mining and has the most reserves of rare earths in the world, with 44 million metric tons as of 2022. By comparison, the United States ranks sixth with 2.3 million metric tons. So, certainly China dominates that industry. Another example I would give is cobalt. As of 2019, China was processing 65% of the world's cobalt. Cobalt is an important component of permanent magnets. Samarium cobalt magnets is a very critical technology. It's used in military technologies such as smart bombs, aircraft, and precision guided missiles. And again, China dominates that sector. So, those are two kind of examples that I would use for kind of high priority ones for defense.
So of the ones that I mentioned at the top, are any of them, so lithium, nickel, cobalt, copper, we talked about rare earths not being here. The others, are they also not found in great quantities in the United States?
Yes. Certainly those are on the list. Copper is not actually included in the critical minerals list, and that's come at some controversy in the industry that copper is not included, because it's certainly one of the most used materials in the Department of Defense. But the USGS has reviewed that and decided that they did not need to include that material. Lithium is included on that list. Lithium-ion batteries obviously is a very high of very high importance to both commercial and defense industry. So that is one of the materials included. Yes.
Yeah, and of course, maybe I'm assuming USGS takes this into consideration, but no one wants a mine near them in the United States, right? And so there is this. While the material may exist, then you've got can we actually mine? How dirty mining is a dirty operation generally, not great for the environment, and so you do have those challenges as well. Is that fair?
Exactly. I mean, environmentally, it's not the most, friendly process. And that is, some of the difficulty with reconstituting some of the capability here. And that also, benefits our adversaries because they are not necessarily worried about that per se.
So you made a good point here that beyond sort of the direct military applications, they also contribute to the overall economic and technological competitiveness of the United States, right?
Right.
So how do our adversaries handle critical minerals? I mean, clearly you're suggesting they have an advantage because they're not, first of all, they have let's talk about China in particular, they have an abundance, and, environmental factors are not high on their list, right? And I've noticed from having traveled in Asia, going to places like Mongolia, where there were Chinese mining going on in Mongolia, and they were just dumping the spoils, making it, and bad byproducts out in their ways to rivers and so on and so forth. Very little concern for that in some places of the world.
Right. Yeah. I mean, certainly our adversaries, particularly China and Russia, do have several advantages over the U.S. and other allied nations that have allowed them to capture market share for critical minerals. They do have just, by nature, a geological advantage. They have a lot of access to mines, for instance. and abundance of water and power in some instances as well. Again, their general disregard for worker health and safety, wastewater and hazardous emissions, and forced labor. Just in general, you mentioned that the environmental impacts for mining and processing, that's definitely a factor. The third is government intervention that gives them a cost advantage. They subsidize their industries. Many of them are state-owned. They give tax incentives, and that provides them with an unfair competitive advantage that drives other countries and other markets, other companies out of the market. Fourth is questionable trade practices. For instance, in 2015, the United States, Japan, and the EU successfully challenged China's rare earth export quota administration system through the World Trade Organization, which agreed that export restraints violated WTO rules. Unfortunately, over the course of this period, from 1992 to 2020, the U.S. had lost at least 4 rare earth magnet production facilities and at least 3 rare earth separation facilities. So even though we won, we lost. So, it's just, they employ every advantage that they can, in a lot of cases, unfair advantages.
So, Chris, I know you're a supply chain expert. So what are the primary vulnerabilities in the global supply chains for these critical minerals? Is it just simply, this is an example of China. They have to sell. I mean, they need to make the money, right? They can't just sort of turn off the spigot completely, right? Because there's a world demand, but they can restrict that supply, I guess, is what you're saying, by putting controls on. But is that the primary vulnerability, or are there others? Are there the routes that these things have to take? What are the big challenges?
Yeah, from a broad perspective, the end of the Cold War marked the beginning of a global reorientation of supply chains for critical minerals. Sources of supply in Russia became available to Western manufacturers in significant quantities. The economy of China, which at the time was only 6% of the size of the U.S. economy, began its meteoric rise. Trade liberalization and global just-in-time supply chains became common practice. Economic efficiency took priority over diversity and sustainability of supply. We optimized our supply chains for efficiency, not resiliency. So that manifested itself in the slow erosion of manufacturing capabilities throughout the United States and many other nations. In addition, as the point of consumption drifted farther and farther away from the point of production, U.S. manufacturers increasingly lost visibility into the risk accumulating into their supply chains, and so did the government. They were suppliers of critical minerals and even the workforce skills necessary to produce and process those materials into value-added goods became increasingly concentrated offshore. So it just, just like with a lot of things, this isn't unique to critical minerals, unfortunately. Same story with semiconductors, same story with, critical chemicals. It's just a model that has eroded U.S. manufacturing, and, unfortunately, China has taken advantage of it.
So you mentioned China and Russia. Are there other countries or regions that sort of dominate this critical minerals basket?
Not really. There are a lot of countries that have resources. I mean, Australia and Canada, for instance, have a lot of natural resources in the critical minerals arena. So they do work in those countries, and we partner with them. There's a lot of resources in Africa, for instance. There's a lot of resources in Latin America. But unfortunately, China has started to take advantage of those as well. China has stepped up its efforts to capture the entire value chain for critical minerals. And they are not limiting themselves to domestic activities in the sector. They have equity positions or outright ownership in cobalt assets in the Dominican Republic of the Congo, Papua New Guinea, and Zambia, for instance. In addition, they dominate downstream processing of cobalt. In contrast, the U.S. has no ability to mine or process cobalt, which we talked about samarium cobalt magnets earlier. China is also investing heavily in mining and energy projects throughout Latin America. State-owned enterprise Power China has more than 50 current energy projects in at least 15 countries in Latin America, including Argentina, Brazil, Bolivia, China, and Peru. So, in a nutshell, China has driven U.S. and other suppliers out of the critical minerals sector with their predatory practices. They provide subsidies to their industries, and many of them were state-owned, as we talked about. They encourage overproduction, which leads to dumping and flooding the market, which drives prices down, which then drives out the competition who cannot be cost competitive. This captures market share, which allows them to monopolize the market. They also weaponize this advantage. In the last year, China has restricted the exports of gallium and germanium. It's been in the news. China produces 98% of the world's gallium and 68% of the world's germanium. They're both used in semiconductors, solar panels, optical fibers, LEDs, infrared sensors. It's caused the price of this material to double in Europe. They restricted exports of graphite. China produces 65% of the world's graphite. They produce 80% of the automotive battery anodes that use graphite. Graphite's used in batteries, obviously, fuel cells, and nuclear reactors. They restricted exports of antimony. China produces 80% of the world's antimony. It's used in semiconductors, primers for weapon systems, and energy storage. Make no mistake, these are not random selections. They know exactly where our pain points are, and these are just really shots across the bow at this point. Imagine what will happen if there is a conflict and the U.S. comes to Taiwan's aid. Both the government and the commercial industry really need to understand the high stakes here and divest of Chinese sources for critical minerals as quickly as possible while there's still time.
So this is a sort of a gloomy picture here, given the fact that, two of our biggest adversaries, China and Russia, seem to control a large portion of the materials that we need. How does the U.S. government, departments, and agencies go about acquiring these materials, right, or assisting in the acquisition of these materials? What's the process?
Right. So I can only speak for the Department of Defense, and they acquire them two different ways. The National Defense Stockpile, which we can talk a little bit more about, acquires them directly from U.S. and foreign sources and even adversarial sources when necessary. For almost all other purchases, and I say almost because there may be a rare instance that I'm not aware of, the defense industry just does the procurement, not the DoD, because critical minerals and the materials that are made within batteries, magnets, semiconductors, et cetera, are way down in the supply chain. And so DoD is not purchasing those, subcomponents. Industry is purchasing those and building those up into the weapon systems and things that DoD actually purchases. So it's industry that is purchasing those. This is most likely the same for other agencies. Commercial industry would acquire the materials and the finished goods and use them to build the products that the agencies use.
So since you raised it, what's the National Defense Stockpile?
Right. So the United States has a National Defense Stockpile that allows them to maintain a stockpile of critical minerals and other strategic materials. However, and it's controlled by the Department of Defense. However, it is a strategic stockpile, not an economic stockpile, meaning that it's intended to offset supply chain risk to defense and essential civilian industry from a national emergency event. So, for example, if we were to get into a large-scale conventional war with China for a specified duration only, and only the president has authority to release materials. In addition, Congress has been diverting assets from the NDS to pay for other defense and non-defense programs. So the current NDS inventory mitigates less than half of the estimated strategic and critical material shortfall for military requirements and less than 10% of essential civilian demand shortfalls. So, while the stockpile is in theory, there to help us deal with supply chain disruptions, and they do a lot of modeling to determine which materials should go into the stockpile, how much material they need, for an emergency event. Unfortunately, that program has seen Congress take the material out of the stockpile or take the assets out of the stockpile for quite some time now. So that needs to be built back up.
We're going to take a quick break, and we'll be right back with Chris Michienzi.
Beacon Global Strategies is the premier national security advisory firm. Beacon works side by side with leading companies to help them understand national security policy, geopolitical risk, global technology policy, and federal procurement trends. Beacon's insight gives business leaders the decision advantage. Founded in 2013, Beacon develops and supports the execution of bespoke strategies to mitigate business risk, drive growth, and navigate a complex geopolitical environment. With a bipartisan team and decades of experience, Beacon provides a global perspective to help clients tackle their toughest challenges.
So other than this, removing material for other purposes, have we tapped the national defense stockpile in an did we tap it during COVID or no?
No, because we did not experience a shortfall of any of the materials that were in the national defense stockpile during COVID. So we did not have to do that for COVID, but we could have if that was one of the things that we had, because the president did declare emergency, during COVID. So we could have if that was a shortfall that we had experienced.
So what you described here about how the government does this is that there isn't a single coordinated effort, right? There's agency and department efforts, but there isn't a broader USG effort to acquire these materials. I don't want to overstate, but I think that's what I heard you say.
Right. Yeah. Again, only speaking for DoD, that is not the way their acquisition is set up. Each service and each program within each service operates independently. They also have different procurement timelines and different industry partners that are executing the acquisition for them. So it would be nearly impossible to coordinate all of that and have a coordinated purchasing program. However, just recently, this is like perfect timing for this podcast. On a related note, Senators Hickenlooper and Tillis introduced a bill in September around this topic. So the National Critical Minerals Council Act would establish a National Critical Minerals Council chaired by the Vice President to coordinate a U.S. critical minerals strategy. That council would be led by a chief minerals advisor appointed by the president who would coordinate actions across federal agencies. That bill coincides with the release of a paper by the Society for Mining, Metallurgy, and Exploration, which cited a key problem in the development of critical materials and minerals in the United States as the lack of coordination between multiple federal agencies and offices. It also complements an ongoing bipartisan effort from the leaders of a Critical Minerals Working Group and the House Select China Committee to develop a suite of policies to bolster the U.S. supply of critical minerals, which they plan to release this year. One of the leaders of that group stated that improving coordination between agencies is a priority in legislation the panel is developing. So there is some move afoot to try to work in that direction.
So do you think these are so it's heartening to hear that there's some overall strategy materializing. Do you think this is the right path? Are there other things that the U.S. government should be doing as we think about, mitigating the risks of shortages of critical minerals and the things that we need to prioritize over the next, 5, 7, 10 years to reduce the vulnerability that we have today? So do you think this is sufficient? Are there other things that we should, as a nation, do? What do you think?
Yeah, I think that, just like with things like the CHIPS Act and other efforts, this kind of problem requires a whole of government effort. So yes, I think that efforts like what the senators are proposing and what the House Select Committee is proposing are good, because I think that coordination among the agencies is required. The government is not a high demand user of these materials, and that's the case with a lot of things like semiconductors. Same thing. The DoD and the government writ large are not a very high demand. It's commercial industry that's a high demand, but if you can aggregate at least all of the federal agencies together, you can at least drive some demand signal. Congress is fond of imposing conditions on DoD to use non-adversarial sources for materials, but DoD alone is just a fraction of the total demand for all the government agencies. So if we can get all the federal agencies to coordinate together, that would certainly be a much better way to approach this. Having said that, I think there's also a number of other things that the government can and should focus on. Certainly, funding and executing additional domestic critical minerals production capacity needs to be in the forefront. The DoD has been making investments through the Office of the Secretary of Defense's Industrial Base Policy Office, where I was the CTO. The Biden administration alone has invested $718 million, and that sounds like a lot of money, but it's not when you're trying to reconstitute an entire capability for 50 materials. And you're not going to do that. You're not going to build back capability for all 50 materials. You're going to have to leverage some capability from partners and allies, and that's completely okay. We need to leverage partners and allies in this fight, but you certainly need some domestic capability, and $718 million is not going to get you there. So we need to have additional funding to be able to continue to build capability in the United States. So that would be one thing. Requiring U.S. industry to use U.S. sources for government programs, that's a biggie, and that's one of the things that I always stress, even with CHIPS Act. I helped write some of the legislation for both the authorization and the appropriation for CHIPS Act, because at first it was like, we'll just fund some fabrication facilities and then we'll solve the problem. And I was like, well, no, that's just solving the supply problem. That doesn't solve the demand problem. And it's kind of, it's not a build it and they will come problem. They're not going to come. If you don't solve the demand problem, you're just wasting your money. So it's the same here. If you can't solve the demand problem, you're not going to win by just solving the supply problem. So you have to be willing to somehow have the purchases of the material from U.S. suppliers. So that means, at least for government programs, we can legislate that industry has to use those sources for government programs, and the government needs to be willing to pay a higher cost for those materials, because again, those adversarial sources are subsidizing their industries, and the cost is always going to be lower. So that has to be something the government is willing to do. So again, that's something that we need to do to solve the holistic problem of demand and supply. Strengthening the national defense stockpile, we talked about that. We need to restore the funding that was diverted from the NDS to acquire additional materials. And then authority to release the materials from the stockpile should be delegated to the Secretary of Defense if the president has declared a national emergency. Right now, the president is the only person that can release materials. And as you can imagine, trying to get approval for the president to release a material is quite the process. So if the president has already declared a national emergency, it should be sufficient for the secretary to release materials. Also, even in non-emergency times, if there is a looming production shutdown due to a supply disruption, the Secretary should be able to loan materials from the stockpile for defense applications in that instance. So that would be something that I think should be considered. Expanding critical minerals from recovery from secondary and unconventional sources and recycling is something that we should really continue. And we haven't talked about that yet, but the Department of Energy, especially, and to a lesser extent, DoD has contributed a lot of funding towards trying to get rare, not just rare earths, but critical minerals from unconventional sources. So, for instance, extracting rare earths from coal. That's a project. So there's other ways to get critical minerals from places other than mines that are more environmentally friendly. And so that would solve some of our environmental issues with mining and processing and significantly shorten the time it takes to build new capability, possibly. So that's an area that we need to, devote more resources to. And then recycling of materials. China does this. You take your old electronics and you recycle them to recover the rare earths or the critical minerals from those materials. And that is something, again, the Department of Energy is devoting a lot of resources to. And we need to continue to do that because, again, that would be a way to, lessen the environmental burden on critical minerals production. So that would be an area that should be focused on. And then lastly, I would say developing and fostering new sustainability standards for critical minerals. If we can get together with industry and trading partners and develop standards for sustainable sources, that can increase supply chain resilience. So that would be an area that would be good to focus on as well.
So, Chris, you just touched on something that, industry and then partners. Some of the strengths of the U.S. are its allies and sort of the non-coercive relationships we have with countries. And then, of course, this other strength is the private sector in the United States. What do you see there for opportunities with, partnering with allies to set standards or, acquire materials? And then, of course, what's the role, do you think, of the private sector in this public-private partnership kind of way?
Right. Yeah, absolutely. 100%. The United States has made supply chain collaboration with partners and allies a main line of effort. The United States, I say this constantly whenever I give talks, the United States has never had and will never have a completely domestic industrial base. We cannot and we shouldn't. We just don't have the demand to sustain the capacity and the capability for a lot of our industries. And, a lot of times partners and allies have better technology than we do. So we should take advantage of that. And there's benefits to having quantities of scale, right? When you're combining your buys with partners and allies. So there's all kinds of, reasons why we need to partner with allies. And it was a key element of the National Defense Strategy that came out, the latest one. There was the Executive Order 14017, which was America's Supply Chains. In the 100-day reports, there was a report specifically on strategic and critical materials, and it was a very big part of that report. And the National Defense Industrial Strategy that was released earlier this year definitely highlighted partnering with allies as one of the mitigation strategies. So it's a key strategy that's woven throughout all of those things. It's also a core recommendation of the Executive Order 13817 report, which was released in the previous administration, which included a strategy for the United States to enter into broad interagency critical minerals collaboration engagements with Canada and Australia, both of whom, which I mentioned earlier, have large domestic critical mineral resources. Other countries have requested similar agreements with the U.S. government, so that's a good mechanism as well that we're pursuing. Japan is another country that we're really working closely with. Japan learned the hard way after 2010 in response to a territorial dispute, which led to a Chinese embargo on rare earth export, complete embargo. So China cut Japan off from all rare earths. So, lesson learned here, we should pay attention. Japan adopted a coordinated national policy to diversify its rare earth supply chains. So we need to, look at that as a possible model for other countries, including ourselves. Japan is also a founding member of the EU, US, Japan Trilateral on Critical Minerals, which is an important platform to exchange technical data and approaches to building secure supply chain for critical materials. And more recently, in June of 2022, the United States and its G7 partners signed the Mineral Security Partnership to produce, process, and recycle critical minerals. And in June 2023, the European Commission president announced that a key pillar of the EU's new industrial strategy will be global partnerships to access inputs needed for industry. All is not perfect, however. That same mineral security partnership that I mentioned that was signed in 2022 does not include any Latin American countries, which unfortunately has reinforced worries in those countries that the U.S. is merely interested in extracting resources from those countries and not developing their local industries. At the same time, U.S. foreign policy, is sometimes at odds with its domestic agenda. We send mixed signals sometimes. The Clean Vehicle Tax Credit and the Advanced Manufacturing Production Tax Credit of 2022 favor domestically sourced critical minerals over most foreign sourced products, conflicting with other U.S. requirements for obtaining minerals from partners, and coming as a shock to countries such as Brazil, with whom the U.S. had established a critical minerals working group in 2020. So again, sending mixed signals. The federal government, as you mentioned, working with public-private partnerships, key, industry is a huge part of this. They're obviously the ones that are purchasing these materials and these finished goods that are going into our products, both in the commercial and industry and DoD. Certainly working with them to establish those standards for sustainable mining and processing of critical minerals is key. We want to make sure that they have buy-in to the fact that we need to have those standards and make sure that they are a key partner in putting together the criteria for those standards, and then establishing standards for the requalification of recycled critical minerals and related components. So making sure that as we are able to bring those materials online, that we are able to insert those materials into our systems in a most cost-effective and efficient way and not a disruptive way, because we want to be able to use those materials again, because that is going to help us with some of our environmental issues with reconstituting capability in the U.S.
So that's great. I mean, it also sounds like there's a role for the private sector here to assist, right? You mentioned about whole of government, but it sounds like it should be whole of U.S. kind of approach to something that affects all of us in our everyday lives. Essentially, is what we sort of talked about at the top of the podcast, right?
Right.
So this is a daunting challenge, but here near the end of the discussion, clearly there is some movement, and there is the potential to make us, I don't know, is resilient too strong a word, or not, maybe not reliant on the, China and Russia in particular. It seems like there's a path here. Is that the way you see it too, or?
Yeah, I think so. I'm typically a very optimistic person, so I always want to give the optimistic view, and I really do believe in being optimistic. I think that again, the Department of Defense, I like to say, has known for a long, long time that supply chains were fragile. It took a while for the rest, I think, of a lot of the rest of the U.S. government, and especially the general public, to understand that supply chains were fragile. And it really took COVID to really open people's eyes to that fact. It wasn't until people couldn't get a car, right, or couldn't get baby formula, to really understand the concept of supply chain fragility. And so I think that really opened people's eyes, but I'm not sure that now that things have kind of gone somewhat back to normal, that people really understand and respect that the problems are not solved, right? So, hopefully that is the case. I think the flip side of that, the good part is that, through 2 administrations and with Congress, there is definitely a recognition of supply chain fragility and the fact that we need to fix these problems and that we need to have more domestic capability for critical things. We don't need to have a completely domestic supply chain. We need to have domestic capability for critical capabilities that, we cannot rely on adversarial sourcing, right? So, I think that's the positive aspect of it, but we definitely need to, have the general public, on board with this as well, because they're, the people that vote and bring their constituents in and the congressional people in. So, because this problem, just like, again, the semiconductor problem and all the other problems, is complex. It's global, it's cross-cutting, and it's going to require a long-term whole-of-government approach by the U.S. as well as close collaboration with our allies, partners in the private sector. And there just needs to be recognition, just like with chips and semiconductor production, that this is both an economic and national security issue. And that's, some people don't kind of get that those 2 things, economic and national security issue, are intertwined. If you hear Gina Raimondo talk, she says that constantly, and that everyone needs to work towards the common goal of reducing our dependency on adversarial sources for these materials. If you thought supply chain disruptions were bad during COVID, just wait to see what happens if we are unable to source critical minerals from China.
Yeah, so that's a really important point, because there are few, if any, 21st century emerging technologies that don't rely on these materials.
Exactly.
I have my iPhone here in my hand. I don't get this if I don't have these technologies.
Absolutely.
Right. And
people just don't get the scale at which this will disrupt everyday life. So, and so I just cannot stress enough the urgency. I did another podcast one time, and it was like, nobody should be sleeping at night, until they understand the urgency of this. We are already too late. We cannot afford to wait any longer to put as many resources as we can towards solving this problem. And so if there's, anything that I want to foot stomp, about this, is that's it. We have to understand how urgent this is, and that we have to all be moving in the same direction.
Chris, thanks for a great discussion, and thanks for highlighting, what's maybe a less well understood national security challenge, but one that has, a big impact on our, not only our security, but our daily lives.
You're welcome. It's my pleasure to be here. Thank you so much.
Thanks. That was Chris Michienzi. I'm Andy McCretis. Please join us next week for another episode of Intelligence Matters. And you can always reach us at intelligencematterspod@gmail.com.
Intelligence Matters is produced by Steve Dorsey with assistance from Ashley Berry. Intelligence Matters is a production of Beacon Global Strategies.